So let me illustrate now that notion of pivoting through the story of the life of a startup. That startup is named Let It Wave. It was founded in 2002 by 3 mathematicians from the Applied Mathematics Research Lab at Polytechnic. What this guy had built was a breakthrough algorithm for compressing still images that allowed to reach much better compression ratio than existing standards that were JPEG and JPEG 2000. These 3 guys were motivated to doing something big. So their first idea was to just replace JPEG. That was the established standard for any image that was circulating on the web. So they started to think about the business case they could build for replacing JPEG. When doing that, they very quickly realized that that very promising, very sexy idea was confronted to a number of big problems. The first one, if you think about it, what are the benefits coming from a higher compression ratio? Bandwidth and storage. And if you think about it, bandwidth and storage are becoming more and more available and more affordable as time goes on. So in other words, the time was going against the core competitive differentiator that their technology was bringing. Not so good. Second important hurdle, if you think about it, the JPEG was the established standard for most of the mainstream usage, handling images on the internet. And despite its limitation, the JPEG was doing okay for the mainstream usage. Replacing a standard that is doing a good enough job is a very tricky challenge. And the first hurdle is actually a consequence of the second one. They try to look at comparables, identify startups around the world that were investigating the same domain that they were interested in. And they identified a number of startups that had already embarked exactly on the journey that Let It Wave was thinking about. And interestingly enough, for the reason I was mentioning, because most of the mainstream usage were being covered by JPEG, who was doing an okay job, most of these startups either died or ended up trapped in a niche, in a small vertical where a better compression was actually bringing a very significant, actionable competitive advantage. In the case of still images, there were 2 that allowed a few startups to survive: satellite imaging and the graphic industry, the process of printing documents, where you have to handle very large, high-resolution images, which led to a very simple conclusion. The startup that survived had revenue that topped, in the best case, between $10 to $15 million. They were still alive, but it was not the project the founders were interested in, really conquering the world. So they started to look elsewhere. They started to look for a very big vertical market where their much better compression ratio could bring an actionable benefit. And they found one. In 2003, 2004 was the moment where the move to biometric ID document was initiated. And they started to realize our technology allows better compression. The ID authentication files for recognizing someone will be stored somewhere in ID document in a chip. The cost of a chip is a linear function of its memory size. So if you compress much more, you need a much smaller memory size for the chip for doing the same job. Hence, significant cost advantage that technology could bring in this ID authentication market. So they worked on their algorithm to optimize the way it works on the geometry of a face. And they reached very interesting results. They were able to compress an ID picture to 500 bytes, 0.5 kilobytes. This is interesting because you can even print a 0.5 kilobyte file in a 2D barcode. They started to visit customers. They applied the principles we talked about. And the initial feedback they got was very positive. They were interested by testing, implementing the technology from Let It Wave because it brought that very significant advantage in terms of memory size. They wrote a business plan in 2005 describing that project. They even got awarded. So they started to execute that plan. When they did that, they started to realize a number of problems. First, the decision process. They were dealing with governments, administration, or very large organizations, which means in the best case, the decision process would take months, but in the average case, it would take probably a few years. Except in the biotech, year is not a good time frame for a startup. So they were confronted to decision processes that were long and that were hard to control because, of course, ID authentication issues are very touchy. And the second problem they realized was market dynamic. The cost of the chip was decreasing rapidly. In other words, their competitive advantage was decreasing very rapidly while customers were still thinking about whether or not they should conduct a test on their technology, which led them to a very simple conclusion: there would be no way they could build a successful business out of that idea. So they entered their third pivot, the video industry. They identified the video industry as potentially promising because it had entered into a double mutation. First, the mutation from low resolution standard definition of the TV signal to high resolution. Second, the large adoption of flat screen TV. They focused at first on that mutation from standard definition to high definition because it raised a very simple problem for content producers, for broadcasters, which was how to convert all my library of content, all the series I'm used to broadcasting every day to my audience from standard definition to high definition. So they worked on a box that could do, in a batch mode, that job, upgrading from standard definition to high resolution the contents that broadcasters needed to broadcast on air. But they realized it was one, small market, and second, the second problem, it's only a transition market. It would only last for the time it took for content producers to upgrade their library of content. So they started to consider their fourth pivot in their life, which was to look at flat screen TV. Flat screen TV was a very interesting case because the adoption of flat screen TV was motivated for the customers by the image quality. And at the same time, the early buyers, the early adopters who purchased the first generation of flat screen TV were often disappointed by the image quality they were getting at home. So LetItWave thought, well, we have a technology that can actually exactly address that problem, optimizing the image quality on flat screen TV to make users, customers happier, because it's the main problem that that market is already confronted to. So they worked on the idea of designing a chip that would do two things in a flat screen TV: denoising and upscaling, adjusting the resolution of the incoming TV signal to the display resolution of the TV. Huge market. They were addressing a real problem. It looked like a good idea. But the same thing happened when they started to investigate that business case. They identified a number of problems. First, a diplomatic problem that every TV manufacturer had an internal research and development lab they were directly competing with. Second, they realized that though the market price of a flat screen TV is 700 euro to 1,000, 2,000 euros, actually the price, the window of price for the image chip is very constrained, between $10 to $12 to $14. So they had to figure out a way to design a chip that would lead to a successful, profitable business selling the chip at that price. And third problem, they realized that in the design of the TV, there was one chip that was assigned all the image management related tasks. So optimizing the image quality for sure, but also managing the menus and handling all the traditional image settings, color, contrast, balance, and so on. So either they would be able to convince TV manufacturer to alter the design of the TV, so instead of having one chip, they would have two chips. That was very unlikely because that would have meant actually an increase in the cost of production of that TV. Or they would design a chip that would do all these tasks, which meant for Let It Wave actually acquiring a number of knowledge for handling all these side tasks that was really totally outside the core know-how, algorithmic know-how that the company was carrying. They considered also licensing that technology to a chip manufacturer, which they very quickly gave up because licensing model is rarely a good model for technology-based startup because you end up getting peanuts of the value, the technology value that you're bringing with your innovation. So considering all these hurdles all together led them to realize that it would be very challenging for them to build a winning business case designing a chip for denoising and upscaling the image within the design of the TV. So they kept looking. And during that process, they identified their fifth pivot. They learned that it was in 2006, 2007, the design of the displays was about to change for a technical reason. The display manufacturers were about to build a new generation of displays with different refreshment rates going from 25 Hertz to 100 Hertz to 200 Hertz. The goal was to actually offer much better motion display, much smoother motion displays on the flat screens. Because they were mathematicians, because they understood the DNA of the technology of their venture, they realized that this was one, a very tricky signal processing problem, and second, that was in the DNA of the technology that they had. So they redesigned, redeveloped their technology into a frame rate conversion algorithm. And they started to work on the design of a chip dedicated to addressing that very simple problem, converting the incoming TV signal that has 24, 25 frames per second into a signal that has 100 or 200 frames per second, which is what is being ultimately displayed on the TV. It meant turning the whole business from an algorithmic math software-based business into a semiconductor business. At that stage, Let It Wave was confronted to a double choice. Raise $30 to $50 million, because this is on average what it costs to design and develop a chip, or sell the business to someone who will do the design and development job of that chip. Raising $30 to $50 million by 2006, 2007 seemed like a very challenging, very difficult journey for the founders, so they made the decision to look for a company interested in acquiring their technology. In 2008, Let It Wave was acquired for $25 million by Zoran, a US manufacturer of chips specialized in the TV market.